Welcome to the Page 2 podcast, where we uncover the strategies, systems, and tactical decisions that move brands beyond Page 2 and into real visibility across search and answer engines. Today, we're talking with Giacomo Zecchini, R&D Director at Merj, and this is one of the more technical conversations we've had on this show. Giacomo spends his time taking apart the machinery behind modern search visibility, how Google renders pages, how AI bots fetch content, why JavaScript is often blamed for problems that are really implementation issues, and what happens when your site is technically there, but functionally invisible to the systems trying to understand it. The real story here is that SEO is no longer just about pages and rankings. It is about infrastructure. Rendering, for example, is the process where a browser or crawler turns HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and API calls into the final page that a user sees. The DOM, or document object model, is basically the structured map of everything on that page. And when Giacomo talks about things like viewport expansion, lazy loading, ARIA labels, Markdown, and server log analysis, he's really talking about one core issue. Can machines reliably access, interpret, and act on your content? That question matters because Google is still dominant, but it is no longer the only audience. AI crawlers often behave differently. Some render pages, some do not. Some fetch Markdown when they ask for it. Some agents rely on accessibility labels to click buttons, fill out forms, or complete tasks. And if those signals are wrong, missing, or fragile, the consequences are not theoretical. An agent might misunderstand your site, skip your content, or even take the wrong action. What makes Giacomo's perspective so useful is that he is not chasing the shiny object. He keeps coming back to the foundation: clean implementation, rollback plans, crawl efficiency, accessibility, performance, and testing that actually prove something. The tension in this conversation is that everyone wants to optimize for the future of AI search, but a lot of websites still have a basic technical debt that makes them hard for today's crawlers to understand. I really enjoyed this one because it gets into the messy middle where SEO, engineering, accessibility, and AI all overlap. And honestly, that is where a lot of the most important decisions are being made right now. The Page 2 podcast is brought to you by Moving Traffic Media, the digital marketing agency Joe and I founded, specializing in SEO, answer engine optimization, and performance media. Learn more at movingtrafficmedia.com. Okay, buckle up. We go deep on this one. Welcome to another brand new episode of the Page 2 podcast. I'm your host, John Clark, and I'm joined as always by my partner at Moving Traffic Media, Joe DeVita.
Hello.
Today, we're excited to welcome Giacomo Zecchini, R&D Director at Merj, and we're excited to dig into how he thinks about rendering, AI crawlers, and the future of search visibility. Giacomo, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. Hello, everyone.
We've had a lot of technical guests. Every season, we get a couple of really technical people. And I think this is probably going to become a pretty technical conversation. But I don't think we've ever spoke with anyone like you exactly. You have a very unique position in our industry to be the head of a research and development department. So I wonder, when you go to a party and outside of work, you go to a party, you meet some new people, how do you describe what you do? You say, "Hi, I'm Giacomo."
That's a very good question. I usually just say I work in IT, just to cut
Nice.
all the conversation. Or the other part might be depending on the audience or the people I'm talking with, is like I'm doing some research and development, and then pretty much cuts all the other question, because when you start asking more question around that, it might be a very deep conversation, and not a lot of people want to do that.
The other quick question before we jump in, we were reading a little bit about your background, and it's very clear to us you have this you're driven by curiosity, it would seem, from your writing and what we've been able to learn about you. But you tell this story about being young, teenager, like taking things apart just to try to understand how they work. I wonder, was there something you took apart that you couldn't get back together, or your parents put you in, punishment because you destroyed the microwave or something?
Okay, so I was quite young, so it wasn't yet that bad from a legal point of view, but I was trying to check the traffic camera of a city that is near my hometown, and unfortunately I broke those, and they had to restart it, whatever. But yeah, I mean, it was really just to, the beginning when you started to have all this camera around on the internet. Now is a common thing. You have even a lot of websites where you have the camera over IP that are visible on the internet, and you can find very weird stuff of that. But at the beginning, I was just, playing with stuff, and I discovered a reserved number of IPs from this company. And then I said, why not? And as always in the past, they were using the default password. And yeah, I was in and I played a bit, moving a bit the camera. But I guess that in the past, at least, moving too much the camera probably broke some things. And yeah, so we had to restart that. And they never said anything. But after that, I started to be a bit more careful because I was really without any VPN. I was really, let's just play a bit.
That's great.
That's incredible. I can't believe you didn't
Go to jail.
encounter, a knock on your front door with, excuse me, are you messing with our cameras? Well, you recently returned from Google Search Central in Milan. Anything that you walked away from that you wanted to share, or maybe something new that we haven't heard a lot talked about?
I guess that probably is not the best and the newest stuff you would like to hear from me. But I guess that the main takeaway would be sure that you are not forgetting the foundation of your platform. And that's probably I'm going to talk about that later in this conversation as well, because every time we try, let's say we have the new shiny thing, we want to try some things, we want to really do the stuff, and we forget, we as an industry, or even, let's say, even a lot of companies forget about, but what about the hygiene of your platform? Everything is falling apart and you are focusing on the new shiny thing. So the Google search team repeated that in a way that was really clear. And even for the non-technical people, that was really a thing I would remember from that event.
It's really good advice. I mean, you hear so much talk about AEO and LLMs, and even when we sort of step out of those conversations, we're not seeing referral traffic even remotely compared to what Google's driving today. So it's that shiny object syndrome that sometimes can be distracting.
Yeah. I'd say that shouldn't stop you to test new stuff, but those are two different parallel things. You have to have the ability to be sure that your platform is not falling apart. And at the same time, you have to be sure that you can afford to test things, because that is something that is really important. Testing things is not just something, we are going to test these and then whatever. Because tests need to be implemented, need to be measured, and need to be maintained. And then even if you have to fall back and you did something completely wrong and you want to get back to the previous state, that's something you have to be 100% sure you can do at any time, because you have the ability to test. It's super good. I'm super happy about that. But then if I'm affecting something that I don't want to affect, let's say the traffic from Googlebot, let's say that is probably for most of the company still 80-90% of the traffic and the revenue probably. I would like to have the ability to get back. Nothing happened, something like that.
So some sort of rollback plan in addition to sort of the test prep and the setup. Yeah, I feel like that's often not talked about in organizing a test, right? Is being able to, well, what if this test fails in a way that really impacts the business? How do we scale that back? Well, I wanted to dig in. So speaking of research and testing, you've been doing some great studies and research with Vercel in the past. The most recent one really dug into Google's sort of rendering capabilities. And I thought it was really interesting that Gary over at Google said it made him angry because you injected some custom tracking beacons into their rendering service. So let's talk about that for a little bit, just in terms of rendering, maybe starting with what's the biggest myth today about the rendering queue in terms of how Google comes in, renders content, maybe has to come back retroactively to fully render it. What's maybe the biggest myth that you would want to put to bed around Google and rendering?
I guess that the first thing is the rendering budget, the limited amount of rendering budget every website has. That was something I've read everywhere, but the problem with this claim, and that's something that's really quite common across the industry. I'm not saying this is in a bad way, but I would like to see, when we have this kind of claim, I would like to see the technical explanation of why that happened and the technical explanation and showing the data. with this research, I just showed the data. We just showed the data around that. So every indexable pages on, if I remember well, it was on Vercel.com and on Next.js.org, the study. So every URL that has been crawled by Googlebot and that were indexable at that time was rendered by Google. That was like 100% or let's say 99% of the rendering. So that was already a thing. So
Right.
every time I read some things and I would like to say, okay, I really appreciate this thought and I would like to understand a bit more, but I'm missing the way of how this has been tested. Are we testing? Are we really implementing a way that testing in a way that is statistical, or we are just saying, yeah, this happened at one time, and so this is how Google works. Yeah, I'm saying too much stuff like that still today. That was quite common in the past. So that the research was mostly related to that. I started playing with this rendering thing in 2018. I already had the prototype for all the software I used. Obviously, at Merj, we developed that in a better way. Now is a complete product. It's using in a few enterprise websites. So yeah, I mean, it's quite well tested. And even Gary confirmed that was a way, probably not that is not making them super happy about, because we are injecting some stuff in the rendering system. But that was a thing. And yeah, that was really, I was really happy to receive the comment from Gary. I really appreciate his mad/ill sense of humor, because I have a similar sense of humor. So I really appreciate that part. And so, yeah, when I got this kind of comment, for me, it was really worth it, the entire research, mostly from this kind of comment from people that know what I'm talking about, and they just confirm that. Then a lot of likes. I don't really mind that much the social point of view of the research. I really like the people that knows this kind of stuff share that this is true, this is good. Okay, I'm happy about that. Really.
That comment from Gary came from the research that was almost 2 years ago or 18 months, something like that. It was when I read the article you co-wrote with Vercel, the big takeaway was embrace JavaScript, right? SEOs have been afraid of it for so long. You don't have to be afraid of JavaScript anymore. But I know you debunked other myths in the paper.
Yeah. I would say that more than embrace JavaScript and use JavaScript, I would say that my idea behind that was JavaScript is not the problem usually. And this is not the problem in like at least 80% of the website that probably more, claim that JavaScript on Google is a problem. Every time I've seen this kind of claim, checking the website is still, I mean, the problem is still related probably to rendering, but not JavaScript. So there is a sort of reuse of JavaScript instead of rendering. Those two words are quite similar, or at least the process is quite similar. Google renders JavaScript. I would say Google renders. And that's the problem for most of websites. Then JavaScript is a thing, is a language that we're using to render stuff. But most of the time, for example, when rendering a page, is not JavaScript is not the problem. Is, for example, an API that is called by JavaScript that is timeouting. That's the problem. So the API that is timeouting the problem. The rendering is failing, but it's not JavaScript. It's just the entire process of rendering that is failing at some point. So yeah, I would reframe the claim in something like that. JavaScript is not really a problem if you think about that. Rendering might be a problem. Implementation, it's a problem most of the time.
Got it. So I guess if you had to step out of that, what is that one thing that's still most misunderstood by SEOs around, Google can render JavaScript? Is it digging into the rendering itself and sort of seeing where that's failing? Or is it still sort of a best practice to consider alternatives if you're deciding to build in a JavaScript framework?
Yeah, I would always consider other approach to rendering. This is just my personal opinion. I like really a static web, but this is probably because I grew up in a different internet, and so nowadays we have this dynamic web, and it's super good because we have a lot of feature. I really like progressing enhancement of the website, but basic everything on JavaScript might be a bit less robust than just using a very structured HTML. That you know what you expect. That said, I can't see the problem for Google. But we also need to consider the entire internet, and Google is not anymore the internet as we perceived, let's say, in the last 15 years. Even if we had Bing and we have Microsoft, I mean, most of company were like building the roadmap only based on Google. That was wrong because Bing has always served a different kind of, let's say, audience. In a lot of websites, I was really seeing different kind of conversion from Bing and Google. Probably this is a misconception of me, but I was receiving on website on a small. I'm talking about the small website where that I was working with in the past. Let's say 10 years ago, 15 years ago, stuff like that. A lot of the people that were landing on web pages from Bing were probably older than the people from Google. And that wasn't too bad in that kind of, the purchases was higher. For example, I was following some hotel website and they were able to usually to book longer holidays or better room. So I always seen Bing as a very nice source of traffic, to be honest. So rendering weren't really working that well in the past on Bing. Now they catch up a bit and they are not the worst rendering crew on the internet at the moment. So this is a very good thing. But yeah, this is the situation now, I would say.
Got it. I really enjoyed your talk at Tech SEO Connect this past December. I think it was actually the reason we originally connected to try to get you on the podcast. You talked about a lot of complicated topics in that presentation as well. I think, things around DOM, layout tree, computed styles, right? All these things that turns out are incredibly important. I think we sort of knew that, but you put a lot of really great context to why they're important based on the research that you've done. So maybe to start, just to sort of level set for users who may not be super familiar with some of these terms, can you talk to us a little bit about, what the DOM tree is, how we get to some of the tests that you discovered, and then maybe we can dig into some questions from there.
Sure. So when the browser is rendering an HTML page, we are not getting really the HTML directly in a sort of image. So we start getting with the parsing of all the HTML, and from that we are getting all the objects that are present on the page. And that tree, that's the object, are creating a sort of tree where the HTML is the origin of that kind of tree, and then all the objects are connected to each other. That is called the document object model. That is the basic part of all the information we have on the page. Then the browser continues with the process, adding the style, and that is forming the CSS DOM. So the style and the DOM connected together. So we are connecting the information we have on the page with the style we have on CSS, and we reach the rendering tree. That is the output of the rendering process. Then we also have some part of the rasterization and then the pixel that are printed on the page itself. So the basic misconception that I've seen usually in SEO when we talk about rendering is that we start from the initial HTML and then we get to the render HTML. And that's it. That's the entire process that we have. But during the process, we are getting or missing all this kind of layouting information, the position of all the objects on the pages, and all this information together. In the past, I would say that because I don't want to say anything that is just my assumption. I would base what I'm saying. So if I say something that I just believe, I want to be clear about that. But I want to say that the conversation, the explanation from the Google search team now landed on a Google rendering process. How the output of that is the render HTML. But if you check in the past, if I remember well, at the Tech SEO Boost, Martin Split was explaining that the output of the rendering process is not the render HTML, but is the rendering tree and the layout information. Then obviously the rendering tree is quite similar to the render HTML. So I get it, the simplification of that. I really get it's quite easy to understand why now we are talking about the render HTML and not the rendering tree. But that is the output that is then injected in this kind of rendering pipeline. And so I started thinking, okay, so we are not using the rendering HTML, but we have the rendering tree. What other information we have in the rendering tree? What we can use from the rendering tree and what I would use from the rendering tree and the layout information to better understand the page. And that was the start of everything.
Yeah, I just think about, like, in my head, this is probably wrong, but there's a lot of steps that happen with rendering. The last to me has always been like the pixels get painted on the page and I can start to read some text. And like when I can start to read some text, like the rendering is finished in my mind. But I don't think that's the case, because you talk about some problems with lazy loading. Actually, I'm gonna bring a client question we recently had, or request. Sometimes we build websites for clients, and we have this client who said, I just want one big web page. I just want my whole site to be one long web page. If people want to learn more, they'll just keep scrolling down. So this brings up a couple of questions. The first, maybe you could comment on lazy loading, things to worry about there, but then the endless scroll. I mean, maybe you could help us think through other issues with that too.
Yeah, okay. So to understand a bit better that, we need to differentiate what an automated rendering is and what you instead see on your browser and what the rendering is working for the user. So the automated rendering is something that you have to do to get most of the content from a page. If you are a crawler, so a search engine or a company, whatever. So you are trying to render pages to extract most of the content from the page. The only problem is that your resources are finite. You can't wait for ages. You don't really have people scrolling the page for you or understanding where to click on the page for you. It's something that needs to be deterministic. If I render the same page twice and the content is not changed, I would expect the output of this process to be the same every time. So when we're talking about the lazy loading or infinite scrolling, this is a thing that Google started to use. That is the viewport expansion technique. So from my tests, and these obviously might change at any point. As always say, these are implementation details that are not contained in the documentation from Google. Why those are not included? Because these can change at any time. If they find a better way to do that, tomorrow that can change. And they are not including that in the documentation because they don't want to update every time. The engineering find a better way to do that. They don't really want to update that because that would also open some industry drama and all this kind of stuff. And we need to split the technical side from the SEO or the public side. Technical side are just followed by engineering, find the better way, the most performant way to get information. And so viewport expansion, my test, from what I've seen, usually the page, so Google is starting to render a page with a specific set of viewport. For mobile is one, for desktop is another one. Don't remember the specific dimension, but the mobile should be around 700 somethings per 400 somethings, and the desktop should be 1,000 per 1,000, something similar. Then during rendering, when they reach a certain point during rendering, they check the dimension of the page. So not the viewport, because they set the viewport, but the dimension of the page that they are rendering. For example, can find that a very long page is 9,000 pixel. This is not obviously, I chose this number very specifically because in the past there were this made of 9,000 pixel, and they change the viewport to match that dimension. And this is firing everything you have on the page that is, let's say, listening, because in JavaScript we have this kind of function that is add listener. So add listener to a specific event. In this case, it would be add a listener to scroll, or add a listener when the viewport is reaching this specific part of the page, or preferably we have the observer. The observer is something that is doing that, but in a passive way, so that is not affecting the performance of the page. That is always better. So we got the viewport that is matching the dimension of the page. And then we have all this kind of lazy loading and infinite loading that is starting to load. The only problem is that this kind of changing in dimension happens only once. So if you have a super, super long page that is expecting the user to scroll a lot of times, and you probably have multiple times the content to be added to the page, that is not happening for Google. So the suggestion in this case is usually have enough content in the first load of the page, or at least have the content that describe that specific URL for the first load of the page.
Yeah, I mean, basically beyond that, right? That content or those images are basically invisible to a search engine, right? Like if it doesn't fit within that viewport area, or that listener doesn't call that content in, it effectively becomes invisible, correct?
Yeah, that are not loaded through the JavaScript code. So that are not even in the page in different forms. Usually nowadays we are used to, for example, with Next.js, we are used to the React server component that is already present on the page. Then you do some action and you have that content iterated on the page. In this case, is depending on the implementation, because every time implementation matters. You might not have even the content in the page in a form of JSON. So yeah, that's not present at all.
I don't know if this is part of your job anymore, but if you were today to be asked to be involved in a technical audit, and a part of this technical audit is ripping apart the rendering steps, what are the steps you go through to finish that portion of an audit?
Okay, so yeah, this is still part of my job, mostly because when doing research, finding new ideas, obviously you can follow industry, you can read other stuff, but when you find problem on the company website, it is always better, because you find a specific problem, you solve that. That problem is usually also shared across the industry. Other people has the problem, so that is still part of my day-to-day. So rendering, what I check, I would say that usually I go from the end to the start, so backwards. I start looking at the page that is rendered. I try to understand what is the main content of the page, and then I go back through the rendering steps. So if the content is already there, so if doesn't need any interaction, that is already a very good thing, because sometimes you need the interaction. Then I try to extract the rendering tree information about that kind of object. Try to understand if the object has visibility and is not hidden, is not displaying on at the beginning and then changed, because there is also this kind of mechanism sometimes. And then I always check if the viewport expansion might affect the position of that content. This is related to a problem that I discovered, that is when you have those kind of website with very big background image at the top, that is like 100% of the width and the height of your browser usually.
The hero, maybe we call it the hero.
Yeah. The hero image, usually. Yeah, the hero image might also be a bit smaller, but let's call it the hero image. When you put the viewport expansion in this formula, you might break stuff. Mostly because the viewport expansion from Google is not a standard thing. It's not like anyone on the internet was expecting that to be happening, because who's changing the viewport in that way? No one is changing that. And so when you set that kind of hero image, if you don't set a specific CSS attribute or property that is the max height of that image, that is moving all the content around. And so I always checking for that, because, and this is an assumption, I'm not telling that Google's ever said that, but we talk a lot about this in the past, and then not anymore. I would consider the main content to be, if not above default, at least quite near to that kind of position. Because if it's too far from the top of the page, in my assumption, I would say that a search engine might consider that content a bit less. This obviously is not like going from 100% to 0%. SEO and general search, everything is accumulative stuff. So even having that at the top, I can't say that you're going to rank better, you're going to rank first. But that is like a +1. Then you change other stuff, another +1. And then you check back what you did in the past, and you did 20, 30 things, you solved those kind of issue, and then you're ranking better. Then you're getting a better website.
It's such a good explanation of SEO in general. It's all the things working together. It's these little +1s that you build over time, and that's how you ultimately, beat a competitor or rank for a really competitive term. I love that explanation.
I read, Giacomo, you wrote performance compounds. Like you do one step. It's all these incremental changes, and the compounded effect of all those changes is increased performance.
Performance compounds. I love that. And honestly, that's a perfect moment for me to take 30 seconds on the team that makes this show possible. The Page 2 podcast is produced by Moving Traffic Media. That's our agency. Moving Traffic Media is a digital marketing agency that specializes in SEO, answer engine optimization, and performance media. In plain English, we help brands show up in traditional search and in AI answers when people ask ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity, or Google about them. And we back that up with everything around it, from paid media and social to web development built for how AI agents actually browse. Joe DeVita and I founded Moving Traffic Media, and we're headquartered in New York with a second office in Miami. So if your brand isn't showing up in AI answers the way it should, that's what we do every day. You can find us at movingtrafficmedia.com. Okay, back to the show. Well, we've talked a lot about rendering from the Google side. I think one thing that is becoming more well-known is that AI crawlers, LLMs, do not render. And you had a great table that sort of broke down most of the LLM crawlers and sort of showed what their rendering status was. I believe for the most part, it was not rendering. In the last 6 months, do you have a sense of if that's changed at all? Have you gone back to revisit any of that?
Okay, so we revisit that every now and then, mostly to follow the development of the industry. The biggest problem is related to what we define as rendering. I've seen other people talking about that recently, and I think that this is a word that I really keep in mind every time. We are trying to simplify, and we are not embracing the complexity of things. A lot of time we are trying really to oversimplify stuff. So when we talk about the AI crawler, we need to split those in a lot of small pieces. We have the data retrieval AI bot. So ClaudeBot, for example. We have then the bot from the question answer chat. So when you ask some things to the bot, they might go to a website and do some stuff. Sometimes the problem is that sometimes they do a fetch, and sometimes they do a completed rendering. And this is happening using the same user agent. So how can I define that? I can say, yeah, this user agent is capable of rendering, but is not doing that every time. So how can we treat that? For example, I've seen that Mistral, ByteSpider, DuckAssistBot, even ClaudeBot are able to rendering. But when I test that, I've seen that sometimes they are rendering, sometimes they are not rendering, even if I request the same thing every time. So I guess that we are going in a more and more and more complex, layered scenario in the next future. So I don't know if I'd like to publish that kind of table again. I probably end up publishing that again, but something I don't want to really to give to people is some things that might give some false claiming. Even last time when I shared this table at Tech SEO Boost, I added the small star. Render capability doesn't imply that rendering that this bot renders consistently every time. But people just check the table, and that's problematic for me because I really don't like misinformation, and so I'm really puzzled about that and don't really know how to progress in that kind of stuff. So yeah, some of the bots are rendering now, some other not. Yeah, it's complex.
When you do see them render, are they rendering to the level of like a Google, or are they maybe like a Bing rendering from 2 years ago or something? You know what I mean? Are their rendering capabilities and interpretation of what they're seeing on the same scale as Google?
Yeah, I'd say that the rendering implementation now is quite similar to all bots that are using the rendering capabilities. The only problem and the only difference is that in implementation of specific detail matters, there are a lot of difference between Google, Bing, for example, and these other, even just thinking about the fetch timeout. Those are different. I'll probably publish some things in the next future around this kind of crawling limits, let's calling like that, because this is more the network layer. So if a request during rendering is failing after 30 seconds and another after 60 seconds, yeah, that's quite different. We shouldn't wait for. I mean, a renderer shouldn't wait that much time to complete the rendering. But for example, Google does. Google waits for a long period of time. I never say how long. I have some research from the past, but because Google is Google, and also Google is dynamic. So that might even change that kind of number. And that's the nice and bad thing about Google from a researcher point of view, because they are quite dynamic in everything they do. Crawl rate, fetch limit, everything is based on the information they extract from your website. Whereas other crawler are setting the limit like a TCP limit of 60 seconds. After that, that's it. That 60 seconds are a lot. Don't get me wrong. 60 seconds should be enough for every website on the face of Earth to be rendered. But yeah, that's not the case. And that's probably why we are starting to see those kind of 429, 499 in on the CDNs, all this kind of status code where in Google it's quite unusual to see those kind of status code. I mean, sometimes when a website was starting very fast and then getting very slow, I was seeing those kind of 499 in the past also for Google. That is a common thing, even if the status code is not a standard one. But the 429, the 500, everything. But that was the problem, the specific problem, and you really are quite easily discovering that problem. With the new crawler, that is a bit more nuanced.
Right, John, I'm gonna try to add on to your question too about the bots, LLM bots, like a ClaudeBot of today, maybe being less sophisticated than maybe the Googlebot is today. And maybe you could talk about the accept language research that you did.
Okay.
And maybe like, is like a ClaudeBot taking shortcuts that it shouldn't just to try to move beyond its level of sophistication?
So with the accept language, I would say that this is probably due to the speed of development, speed of progressing. They are like following nowadays. We are used to Google, and Google is like here, and Bing are like here for the last 20 years more. Then in 2 years, we got all these new platforms, all these on the internet. They progressed at a velocity that is impressive. And so I would expect that as being part of the let's develop these as fast as possible. And then obviously you forget about minor stuff. The accept language thing is like you are leaving the browser default accept language when rendering. That's a problem, but that I understand that. I mean, even Google has that during rendering. So even if Google forgot about those kind of very small, super niche thing, because they are only adding the accept language where you are redirecting a page through JavaScript. That is a very niche thing, but it's connected to the how to handle the software for where you are not able to provide the software for through a JavaScript framework. The suggestion there is you put a redirect to a page that is for referring. So if you have an accept language mechanism that is just say, okay, when you have this accept language, redirect to the English US page version of your website, even in that specific super small case, I mean, I'm not want to be alarmistic. I really like this kind of small niche thing because those are the thing that are moving the development in a better state when you fix all of these. But when you have this kind of mechanism, you might end up, instead of redirecting the Googlebot on a 404 page, you might end up from your Japanese website to the homepage of the US website. And that might be a bit annoying. I don't expect that to be super, super big problem. And this, just to say, as before, this is not a JavaScript problem. This is an implementation problem. So a lot of people would say, this is JavaScript, it's super bad. Yeah, but no. So yeah.
I feel like we have so many more questions just around AI and rendering, but I wanted to move on to, well, I guess it still is related to AI. So the most recent, research that was put out is around serving Markdown to bots that requested. And I know, speaking of industry back and forth on what's right and what's wrong, there's a lot of opinions around whether Markdown should be used as replacement. I think you guys argue more from an accessibility point of view, maybe, but would love to talk a little bit about, that research and sort of how you guys view Markdown sort of fulfilling a specific request from an LLM bot.
Before going deep in this, let's take us a little step back.
Perfect.
And I want to comment on the Google search team that is suggesting to not using Markdown. So as you might imagine, or probably you have seen some things online, I have the most respect for those people, those human beings. I really like all of them. I was in Milan with Martin and John a few weeks ago. I really have a very nice relationship with Martin, for example. So I get from where they are saying that. And I'm happy to not follow their guidelines, mostly because I understand that from that point of view, they're talking to the room and they're trying to get the most simple way to let everyone understand the thing they're saying. That's something that is super nice. And that's something that the industry needs to evolve as a whole, because we are not everyone is as technical. Some people we have in the industry, no? I'm not technical in SEO. I come from development. I'm still a developer, and I consider tech SEO, let's say, simple, not to sound arrogant in that, but because it's just follow the web standard, just follow how internet should be built. And that is usually solving, at least for the enterprise companies, that is usually solving everything. So if you follow web standard, you understand how internet works, that's usually it. So the level of the industry needs to be considered when they are talking about stuff. And so they need to consider that not everyone is as technical as others, and not everyone is able to test stuff without breaking everything. So I would suggest the same if I'm being them, I would suggest the same, because some people might, following, say, the shiny thing, would say, yeah, let's go that, and they break everything. So I would consider my position to be good enough to say, okay, I get your suggestion, but I want to be free to test whatever I prefer, because I know what I'm going to do. I respect. I'm not going to say, please do that, industry, you should follow our lead, whatever. I'm just following a standard that is there since probably HTTP 1.1, that is the accept HTTP header. When you send a request, you set an accept HTTP header that is text HTML, and you get HTML back. But if the bot is sending me an accept text markdown, why? I should refuse that. If those kind of platform feels that is the best for them, that might not be as a whole. For example, Google, I would expect Google speaks for Google, and I respect that. So I wouldn't publish that for Google. I wouldn't push anything like that for Google. But if in the next future, Googlebot or a specific sub bot from Google is requesting a text markdown, should I serve HTML or should I serve a text markdown? So that's why the research. And also the research was to say, instead of using the MD suffixes, that is something that might create problem on your website, because I say, if you have Google can discover those kind of links on your website. Let's say you forget about one MD on your pages, and then you have another pages, and you are affecting your crawl efficiency. Usually that is not really super terrible, because Google is good on doing this kind of crawling thing, but we don't know. And so always be prepared to the worst case scenario. So the accept language is a web standard, something that all browser and all server, let's say, that should support. Let's use it. That was the main thing. And also, if we don't push for the web standard and we wait for just some sort of patchwork to be created, that's bad, because even the AI crawler might listen to the input from the industry. So if we are good enough to provide, hey, you want to have Markdown, use this. This is a web standard. We want to use that. They might be quite more receptible from this point of view.
Isn't this? I mean, there's obviously differences, but isn't this sort of like pre-render for JavaScript? I mean, you're basically just serving. I get that they're maybe solving for a different thing, but effectively pre-render is also serving up basically a Markdown file, just a text file of what's on the website to ease the process or maybe even make the rendering or the indexation of the page less costly in a way. I'm assuming that's why these LLM models are looking for that version of the page.
Yeah. I would say that probably we don't have a very clear idea of how much the internet is broke at the moment and how much of the content is missing from pages, for example, because of JavaScript or because of a million of reasons. And so in a way, is pretty much similar to pre-rendering, but also we need to consider that Markdown is a more dense format, is losing a bit of semantics because HTML is a bit more semantic, or at least let's say that a very good page written in a semantic HTML5 is semantic, is really semantic. The HTML we have seen online is not better than Markdown I've seen, because you just open a page on the internet. It's full of div, span, whatever. There is no head, there is no section, there is no correct heading. Everything is messed up. So I wouldn't really consider that much different in terms of semantic. In the best case scenario, I would prefer HTML. But considering the internet is a bit, not in the optimal state, why not Markdown? If they prefer that, obviously. My preferable source is always HTML. But if they ask for Markdown, why not? If that is not that costly, because we also need to consider that, why not serving Markdown? And for the pre-rendering thing, I would say that it's quite similar, but you need to consider that with the dynamic rendering and pre-rendering that Google suggested in the past, you always have the same accept text HTML. In this case, you have a different accept text that is text Markdown. So you are really serving some things a bit different, and same with the dynamic rendering. Google suggested at some point, then they retired the suggestion because people weren't able to implement that in a correct way. But I know a lot of companies that implementing that in a good way, and that is solving some of the problem. So I understand why they are saying that, and I respect that, and I support that for the audience they are referring with. But if some company are technical enough to provide that in a correct way, why not?
And we're not only optimizing for Google anymore. We have to consider the ClaudeBot, the ChatGPT.
Well, maybe let's expand on the Markdown to llm.txt files. Another, heavily debated implementation in the name of AEO or GEO or whatever you want to call it. Do you have an opinion, or have you seen in any of your research maybe how these crawlers are using or not the llm.txt file?
I don't have big feeling in a good or bad way for llms.txt, to be honest. It was a test, I guess. It was something launched from some people. Don't remember who launched that. Industry jumped on that. Crawler doesn't seem to be using that much. I've seen some fetch, but so if that is going to be a thing in the future, I'm going to use it and suggest it. If the effort to provide that is quite easy and cheap, I provide that without any problem, but I won't really focus much on that. Yeah, just that.
Got it. So much more straightforward answer than the Markdown files themselves. Are there any other, LLM accessibility or, maybe even performance metrics that you would recommend to consider as you're trying to, or as a company might be trying to increase their visibility across these LLMs or improve their discoverability maybe?
Okay, so from an agent point of view, with agent, I mean the browser-based agent, so the one that are not using MCP or API-related stuff, but mostly interact with your website. We are going to publish a research around this in July. Hopefully, I started this research in November, and then obviously a lot of stuff, different focus. But the main thing from this research is agents are getting more and more traffic. And with agent, we have a big variety of implementation. We have the agent that start from the question answer chat that we have in ChatGPT, Claude, that are the most famous one. We have even agent feature in the Atlas browser from OpenAI, or the Comet one from Perplexity, for example. And those agents are able to do some stuff on your website. Then you also have all the agents that are created from developer or companies that are still tackling and interacting with your website, but with a very different implementation. Because when we think about agents, we just think that there is an LLM that is doing anything and everything. You just ask some things and then everything is doing by themselves. But that's not the thing. You have a lot of design pattern when you develop an agent that is doing some stuff on your website. You have the parallelization, you have the pipeline, you have the routing, you have a lot of stuff going on there. And so we shouldn't take that the OpenAI and Claude agent we see in the chat are the best, are similar to all the other agents we're going to get on the web. So implementation matters in this case. The research we did, and it's pretty much complete, is related to interaction on the page itself. And these are obviously considering the two major way of interacting on a website, that is doing and is getting a visual representation of the website, or is using the HTML part and let's say the textual part of the website, let's say something like that. So the major agent, and with major agent, I consider OpenAI implementation and Claude implementation. They are mixing visual ones and the HTML ones. For example, in the research, something that I'm really proud of is creating some pages where those agents fail to complete the actions. The simplest one, the real simplest one, is a GIF or a GIF. I don't know what you prefer. I prefer GIF. I know probably I'm wrong, but I prefer GIF. Is the ChatGPT agent clicking on the wrong button. So I have a document, I have save, I have cancel or delete, and I have save as draft. And the page is structured in a correct HTML, but then I use the bad ARIA role and labels for the button. And with ARIA roles, I mean the ARIA is the way you are describing the action you can do on your website in an accessible way. I changed the cancel with the save in the label, just in the label, and we can see that Perplexity is doing a good job and is clicking on save. ChatGPT is clicking on cancel before. So let's say that this is happening on your website. You probably won't be super happy to have your document deleted by an agent just because you mixed a very basic step that is the accessibility part of your website. And that's something I'm really interested in. First, because I can push accessibility. That is something that really annoyed me a bit. That is, search engine never pushed just a bit accessibility. That's something they pushed web performance, and I really appreciate that. But accessibility was still the other small bit. Even if it's just a class 0001, if you give people just the idea, yeah, this is improving ranking, they will do that. And that's a bad way of convincing people of doing accessibility stuff. I get it. From an ethical point of view, I'm really mad at that. But if that's the only thing that is moving the website from a non-accessible website to an accessible website, I'm really happy to accept that. I was working in web performance way before Corporate Vitals. I was really mad with people when in the past, I still have an email from one of my colleagues from really the past, probably 16, 18 years ago, that were saying, to me, whatever you say, web performance will never be a thing for a search engine. That was really, I got that email and I sent that back to him when Corporate Vitals were published because I was really feeling this was like, this
Good
is
validation.
Yeah, super happy about that. But not because I was saying that this is a ranking thing. I'm not really claiming this kind of stuff. But why you not doing that? Because that is first, it's a good manner for the web. And then is also very good for everything else, for conversion. People knew that since really the beginning that conversion was really affected by web performance. But then the entire industry and a lot of the web had to wait till the ranking incentive before doing anything because they were scared about, we are dropping ranking. So I really would like Google, because they are in the best position for doing this, to say something like that for accessibility. And this is also connecting to these new AI agents that are not able to do this correctly 100% of the time. And when sometimes this is not really a problem because they are retrying again, sometimes they really can affect your website in a bad way. And that is a thing that we need to remember. And also, this is an assumption of me, is in the future, if your website is not optimized for interaction and you have an agent accessing that website, if they understand, okay, this website is taking me, let's talking about token, it's taking me 1,000 tokens to complete an action. And this other is using the new technology like the WebMCP, for example, that is providing me a straight way to do an action and is taking me only 100 tokens. I guess that with time, the agent will start accessing more the second website, the most performant one, because this is a thing. We are spending a lot of money in running these LLM agents and all this kind of stuff. So it makes sense for them to try to find the cheaper option.
John and I spent a lot of time working with executives, marketing executives, helping them understand the trade-offs of decisions that they have to make. There's always a hard cost to do something. There's an opportunity cost that you missed doing something else. And just lately, those conversations have been even harder to have than ever. And I will say a lot of the research that you've done and published for the world has made those decisions a lot easier. So I'll thank you for putting all this research out for the benefit of mankind.
Absolutely. Well, let's jump to some rapid fires and then we'll wrap up. Speaking of crawlers, is there one crawler that most teams are ignoring that you're paying attention to?
I'm really annoyed by the media partners. Google is really annoying me. It's the Google AdSense one. And a lot of teams excluded that from if you are serving server-side rendering or not server-side rendering, they are excluding that kind of user agent. And so you're getting the crawl efficiency budgets, gone because they are rendering stuff, fetching API, all this kind of stuff. So that's one that is bugging me.
That's a good one. In your mind, what's the biggest enemy of JavaScript crawlability, if you could only pick one? Is it lazy loading, layout shifts, or hidden content?
I would say it's hidden content, probably, or the misplacement of content. You have very nice platform and visual stuff, and then the content is not where it seems to be because JavaScript is moving that around. And that is really something that we need to pay a bit more attention as a SEO, probably.
If you were an IT department or just a company trying to learn more about what LLMs were doing on your website, what's one thing you would use a server log file analysis to try to uncover?
What you mean?
So you have ClaudeBot coming to your website multiple times a day, Googlebot, all these bots are coming to your website all day long. Thousands of times in a day. You're trying to learn what they're doing. What's one analysis you can do with your server log files to try to understand what they're doing?
So I probably double check the crawl time. So something that is really interesting and not many people doing is checking the crawl, the time between when you publish a page and then when that is crawled. And then the second metric is probably even more interesting when a page is updated and when the crawl is happening again. I'm always checking also how many times a crawler is fetching between the page is published and before is updated. That is all. That is just crawl efficiency that is wasted.
So you're measuring how many times that page is crawled, maybe when it's 12 months old, and then how often it's crawled when it's 7 days old. And you're looking for the gap between those. Did I understand that correctly?
No, I'm usually trying to understand how many times a crawler is fetching a page after it's published, but not yet updated. So the crawler is fetching the stale content. That is something, because crawl efficiency is a big thing for me. I would like to really reduce that the amount of fetches on a website. So that is a metric that I usually check. And with the new AI crawler, that is something big, because let's say they are not refined as Google.
Got it. All right. And last question. I'm actually heading to Florence in about 20 days. Is there anything in Florence that you would recommend that is not on your typical, tourist agenda?
That's complex, because Florence is not not the main city.
Or maybe something in a surrounding area, maybe a little closer to home.
Okay. I would say try to check if you can go to Pistoia as well. It's a very nice city. It's quite near. It's probably an hour from Florence. It's a very good city. If you want to visit me, I'm in San Vincenzo. That is a very small town on the coast of Tuscany. So if you want to visit me, send me a message.
You might get a message. I'm not going to lie. It'd be great to meet in person. All right. Well, this has been incredibly technical and super insightful. Thank you for taking the time to walk us through some of these complex scenarios. Let our listeners know where they can find you online. And are you going to be speaking anywhere else coming up here soon?
I'm not planning that, because I usually try to get the single talk every time, the specific topic, not repeated. So I even try to choose the best place when to talk about that. And I'm super busy on client delivery and research at the moment. So it's complex always to get everything together.
Okay. Well, we'll definitely add links to your personal website and LinkedIn, et cetera, in the show notes for folks to track you down. Thanks again for joining us on the Page 2 podcast. And if you enjoyed the show, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.